With the release of SCP Blackout's gigantic redesign around the corner, as well as the release of SCP Labrat, I figured it was time for everyone to get up to scratch with just what the hell this SCP thing is all about. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining what the SCP Foundation is, and then briefly how it ties into both of the SCP Blackout and SCP Labrat games. Now with that in mind, let me take you on a journey. Back almost 250,000 years ago, to where mankind was nothing more than an ape, in a very complicated world. So in the beginning, mankind cowered in damp caves by small fires, fearful of the things that they didn't quite understand. Enormous birds with heads of men and rocks that came to life, they called them gods, demons, and prayed for their salvation. But in time, their numbers dwindled, and humanity thrived. Yet the unexplained could never truly go away, and with nobody to help them, well, it was up to humanity to stand for themselves. Enter the SCP Foundation, an organization tasked with the containment of all anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena that threaten the everyday normal that we perceive today. They act swiftly and often extremely as the highest human authority above governments and above law to make sure that nothing can stand in the way of their mission. This very mission can be divided into three simple goals. Secure. The Foundation secures anomalies with the goal of preventing them falling into the hands of civilian or rival agencies. Contain. The Foundation contains anomalies with the goal of preventing their influence or effects from spreading. This is achieved by either relocating, concealing, or dismantling such anomalies, or by preventing the spread of knowledge by the general public. Protect. The Foundation protects humanity from the effects of such anomalies, as well as the anomalies themselves, until such time that they are either fully understood or can be explained using scientific theory. The combination of these goals and the act of seeing them through is essentially what the SCP Foundation is, at its core. Now these anomalies can take on many forms. They could be an object, an entity, a location, or a freestanding phenomenon. So the Foundation maintains an extensive database of contained anomalies requiring special containment procedures, or SCPs as they are commonly referred to. This information is categorized by their ability to be contained, which is made up of 5 primary classes. Safe class SCPs are anomalies that are easily and safely contained. This is either due to the Foundation having a good understanding of the SCP, or that the anomaly requires a specific activation, or trigger, to take effect. Be aware though that just because an anomaly is considered safe does not mean that it cannot pose a threat to humanity when released to the world. Euclid class SCPs are anomalies that require more resources to contain completely, or where containment isn't always reliable. This is commonly due to a lack of understanding of the SCP, or that the SCP is self-aware and able to act in an unpredictable manner. Euclid is the most common form of classification, just purely due to the sheer number of self-aware and unexplained SCPs in the world. The next are Keter class SCPs. These are anomalies that are exceedingly difficult to contain consistently or reliably, with containment procedures often being extensive and complex. This is due to either a lack of understanding of the SCP or a lack of the technology required to properly contain or counter it. Note that a Keter class SCP does not necessarily mean that it is dangerous, just that it is incredibly difficult to contain. Thaumiel class SCPs are anomalies that the Foundation specifically uses to contain other SCPs. These are classified at the highest level of clearance, with their details and locations often unknown. And finally, we have neutralized class SCPs. These are anomalies that are no longer anomalous, either by being intentionally or accidentally destroyed or disabled. So what about the people that manage these SCPs? Well, anomalies are kept in secure holdings at one of the many Foundation sites across the world. Each facility has its own area of expertise, so the staff operating at each site varies. Instead, personnel are classified from A to E, with each corresponding to their exposure to potentially dangerous anomalies. Class A personnel are those deemed essential to the Foundation's strategic operations, such as Foundation Council members, and are not allowed direct access to anomalies under any circumstances. In the event of an emergency, Class A are always the first to be evacuated. Class B personnel are those deemed essential to local Foundation operations, such as site directors, and may only be granted access to SCPs that have passed quarantine and have been cleared of any mind-altering or memetic agents. Class C personnel are personnel with direct access to most anomalies not deemed strictly hostile or dangerous. They include researchers, scientists, and medical experts. Class C personnel that have had direct contact with potentially mind-affecting or mimetic properties may be subject to mandatory quarantine and psychiatric evaluations as deemed necessary by security personnel. Class D personnel are expendable and used to handle extremely hazardous anomalies and are not allowed to come into contact with Class A or B personnel. Class D personnel typically come from the ranks of prison inmates convicted of violent crimes, especially those on death row. In the event of a catastrophic site event, Class D personnel are to be terminated immediately, except deemed necessary by on-site security personnel. Class E is a provisional classification applied to field agents and containment personnel that have been exposed to potentially dangerous effects during the course of securing and establishing containment of new SCPs. Class E personnel are to be quarantined as soon as possible, where they will be monitored and screened for potentially harmful changes in behaviour or physiology. Well, if you haven't run away screaming yet, or turned a blind eye to the situation, I should mention that the SCP Foundation is a purely fictional organisation that consists of creative writers and artists from all over the world. You can find their wiki page in the description to read through hundreds of approved SCPs and even have a go at making your own, so I definitely recommend taking a look at that at the end of the video. But more recently, game developers have taken an interest into the Foundation, with the game SCP Containment Breach being the most popular of all. Being a VR channel myself, I won't dive into it too much, but I will point your attention to a game called SCP Labrat, which aims to faithfully recreate SCP Containment Breach in virtual reality. Both this and So Containment Breach are free survival horror games that see you playing out a containment breach inside one of the SCP Foundation's secure facilities. As a D-Class, you are left behind to fend for yourself against some of the SCP universe's most renowned SCPs, with SCP-173 featuring as its main antagonist. Now, it may look like something a 3-year-old made out of Play-Doh, but this thing kills all living things on sight, moving towards its victims at a speed of several feet in one blink of an eye and snapping their necks with irresistible strength and lethal precision. Now, if that sounds like a good time to you, I'll leave the links to both SCP Labrat and SCP Containment Breach in the description for you to check out at the end of this video. But finally, there's another game I want to point your attention to, and that is SCP Blackout. For those looking for something new in the SCP universe, this game has got you covered. It's both a desktop and VR supported game that also has you playing as a D-Class, yet this time the events take place in Site 50, a sort of post office for the SCP world. This one handles things slightly differently, as all of the SCPs were created by the developers or the community, so are completely new to the franchise. The main antagonist is known as SCP Teller, who is essentially a 21-meter tall humanoid whose body absorbs all light except for 2 red emitters on its head. SCP Teller is capable of converting anything it touches into smaller iterations of itself, and is on a mission to envelop the world in darkness. Scary, right? Well, that's just the start, because the developers plan on creating a completely new story mode that builds upon the survival lore and will explore their SCPs in more detail. Links in the description for that also. Now, both of these games are set to release this end of 2020, so if you want to see some full gameplay videos of those when they come out, then please feel free to subscribe by clicking the icon below. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope that you were able to learn something new today. So until the next time, and before my voice gives up on me, goodbye!